When I was 57, my only son sold my house right out from under me, packed up his wife, and moved 2 states away. They left me exactly $150 and a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 15 years on my grandson typed my name into a search engine for a school project and rang me sobbing. Before 12 hours had passed, I was staring at 200 missed calls from the same son who tossed me aside like I meant nothing. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge, the place where the stories no one talks about at the dinner table finally get told. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found your way in. Tap that subscribe button so the next story comes straight to you without you having to go looking for it. Before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from right now and what time it is there. I always wonder who is out there sitting with these stories and when. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been fictionalized for the purpose of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. It is the truth underneath the story that matters. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I picked up the device, feeling the cold metal against my calloused hands, hands that had labored without rest for decades to construct a life my own flesh and blood had once stripped away. I swiped the screen and answered, pressing the receiver to my ear without uttering a single word. Ragged, uneven breathing poured through the speaker. Then a voice broke the silence, young, trembling, strangled by tears. "Grandpa?" The word landed like a fist to the chest. It was Ethan. The last time I laid eyes on my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy digging in the dirt of my backyard, with no inkling of the monstrous betrayal his parents were quietly engineering inside the house. I said nothing, letting the crushing weight of 15 years of absence hang between us. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Ethan begged, his voice fracturing into a sob. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know any of it. I was writing a research paper for my university business class today. My professor had us profile leading philanthropists in the biotech industry. I typed your name into the search bar just to find out if you were even still alive. The Bloomberg magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who gives away half his fortune to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I shut my eyes and let out a long, measured breath. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt cut off entirely from the pandemonium on the other end of the line. "Yes, Ethan," I said at last, my voice level, carrying the full gravity of a 72-year-old man who had clawed his way back from total ruin. "It is me." A raw sob tore from the young man's throat. Ethan was 22 now, but in that moment, he sounded like a child utterly lost in the dark. "They told me you abandoned us." He choked out the words, spilling in a frantic, stumbling rush. "Mom and Dad said you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you built your company from the ground up 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what exactly did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. There was no need. Real power never requires shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Ethan." I answered, calm and deliberate. "They chose to take everything I had, and they chose to lie to you about it. I rebuilt my life from the rubble they left behind. I didn't run away. I outlasted them." I could hear Ethan weeping, the devastating truth of his parents' character collapsing onto him all at once. But before he could form another question, the audio on his end lurched and went muffled. A violent commotion erupted. A door crashed open, and Ethan let out a sharp, startled gasp. "Give me that phone." A hard, commanding voice cut through from somewhere in the background. I could hear Renata calling out in the distance, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle followed the scrape of plastic against skin, and then the line dropped for a fraction of a second before a different voice came through the receiver. It was Craig, my son. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof from over my head. "Dad!" Craig's voice was frantic, breathless, but underneath the performance of panic, I could detect the unmistakable, nauseating frequency of naked greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been searching for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, though my pulse didn't climb. I felt no fear, no sudden swell of paternal warmth, only a cold, precise clarity. The son who had discarded me like a worn-out tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he had missed his father, because he had just learned his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something." Craig pressed, his voice slicked with cloying desperation. "My company is in serious trouble. We are staring down a massive crisis. When Ethan showed us that article, I couldn't believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We are family, Dad. You have to save us. I listened to his frantic breathing, picturing the panic and raw avarice contorting his face. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, soft-hearted father he had abandoned 15 years ago to come rushing in and pull him clear. But that man no longer existed. They had buried him the day they pressed a crumpled $150 into my palm. I drew the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon and pressed it. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone back on the polished walnut desk and let the room settle back into total, unbroken silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The screen of my smartphone lit up the pitch-black darkness of my private study, throwing a pale, hard light across the polished walnut desk. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline burned like scattered diamonds against the night, a sharp contrast to the dark tide of memory rising inside me. My phone was buzzing again, relentless and frantic, shaking against the desktop as one notification stacked on top of another. I settled back into my wingback chair, perfectly still, watching the calls accumulate. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not let up since noon. I lifted the phone and felt the cold metal press against my calloused hands, hands that had worked without pause for decades to build something my own blood had once taken from me. I swiped the screen and answered, bringing the receiver to my ear in complete silence. Ragged, unsteady breathing filled the line. Then a voice pierced the quiet, young, shaking, thick with tears. Grandpa. The word hit me like something physical. It was Ethan. The last time I had seen my grandson, he was 7 years old, scraping in the dirt of my backyard, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal being arranged by his parents inside the house. I stayed quiet, allowing the enormous weight of 15 absent years to settle between us. "What, Grandpa, please don't hang up," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking apart. "I didn't know, I swear to you. I had no idea about any of it. I was working on a research paper for my university business class today. My professor assigned us to profile leading philanthropists in the biotech industry. I put your name into the search bar just to see if you might somehow still be alive. The Bloomberg magazine article came up. The biotech billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, deliberately. The stillness of my top-floor penthouse felt completely sealed off from the chaos spilling through the phone. "Yes, Ethan." I finally answered, my voice steady, carrying the full weight of a 72-year-old man who had survived being left with nothing. "It is me." A hard sob broke from the young man's throat. Ethan was 22, but in that instant he sounded like a devastated lost child. "They told me you abandoned us," he wept, the words rushing out in a desperate torrent. "Mom and Dad said you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and walked away and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you started your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. True power has no use for shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Ethan," I replied, unhurried and composed. "They chose to strip me of everything I had, and they chose to deceive you about it. I rebuilt from the wreckage they left me in. I didn't flee. I survived them." I could hear Ethan crying, the full, devastating weight of his parents' true character bearing down on him. But before he could ask anything more, the audio on his end suddenly muffled and a violent scramble broke out. A door slammed open, and Ethan let out a sharp gasp. "Give me that phone!" A harsh, imperious voice barked from somewhere behind him. I heard Renata shouting in the background, telling him to put it on speaker. A short struggle followed plastic scraping against skin, and then the line cut out for a heartbeat before a new voice arrived in my ear. It was Craig, my son. The man who had held my gaze 15 years ago smiled and quietly arranged the sail of the roof above my head. "Dad!" Craig's voice was frantic and breathless, but beneath the manufactured urgency I could hear the unmistakable sickening pitch of pure greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to find you." My grip on the phone tightened, but my pulse didn't climb. No fear, no sudden surge of paternal feeling, only a cold, precise clarity. The son who had cast me aside like a broken tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he had missed his father, because he had just discovered his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Craig begged, his voice slicked with a cloying, sickly sweetness. "My company is in trouble. We are staring down a massive financial crisis." And when Ethan showed us that article, I couldn't believe it. "You have to tell me where you are. We are family. Dad, you have to save us." I listened to his ragged breathing, picturing the panic and greed twisting his face. He was reaching for a lifeline, reaching for the soft, forgiving father he had walked away from 15 years ago, the one who would come running to his rescue. He actually believed that time and shared blood would wipe away the memory of standing alone in an empty driveway, clutching a pathetic wad of cash, while the moving truck disappeared around the corner. But that man was gone. They had finished him off the day they pressed a crumpled 150 into my hand and told me to figure it out. Now he wanted me to bail out his failing real estate business. He wanted the billionaire philanthropist, not the father. I drew the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon, and tapped it. The line cut with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone down on the polished walnut desk, and the room dropped back into perfect, undisturbed silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The heavy doors of my private boardroom swung shut with a quiet click, sealing us in. Craig dispensed with pleasantries immediately. He crossed straight to the long glass table and slid a thick, glossy folder across its surface. It skidded to a stop directly in front of me. I looked at the folder, then I looked up at the man who used to be my son. He had on a tailored suit that fought hard to conceal the sweat building on his brow. He planted both hands flat on the glass and leaned forward, demanding a $2 million loan to keep his failing real estate firm alive. He talked fast, throwing out phrases like liquidity crisis and temporary market downturn, working to sound like a sharp operator closing a deal. But the panic behind his eyes told the real story. He was going under, and he expected me to be the rope he grabbed on the way down. I leaned back, hands resting still on my lap, and let him finish. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched the staggering audacity play itself out. Then Renata joined in. She was seated beside him, in an expensive silk dress bought on someone else's dime, legs crossed with a rehearsed elegance that turned my stomach. She leaned in, her tone shifting from sugary sweetness into sharp accusation without missing a beat. She looked me square in the eye and said that while the loan was the immediate priority, we also needed to discuss Ethan. She had the nerve to tell me that growing up without a grandfather had been deeply painful for my grandson, that my sudden disappearance 15 years ago had carved a profound psychological wound in Ethan's life. In her version of events, I was the one who had walked away. She sat there in my room and demanded I establish a substantial trust fund for Ethan. Without delay compensation, she called it for my absence during his childhood. The sheer brazenness of it sat heavy in the air. These were the two people who had tricked me into signing over my power of attorney, while grief had left me hollow after losing my wife. They had liquidated my home, loaded their things, and vanished across state lines, leaving me with a single crumpled $100 bill of $50 and a note telling me to figure it out. Now they were rewriting the whole story, positioning themselves as the forsaken victims of a negligent runaway father. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl the folder back at them. The anger living inside me was not a fire. It was a glacier cold, immense, and moving with absolute purpose. I looked at the $2 million proposal, then at Renata, then at Craig. I let the silence stretch 10, maybe 15 seconds. I creased my brow slightly and exhaled a quiet sigh, performing the role of a weary, guilt-ridden old man, genuinely torn by the burden of his past, and seriously weighing their demands. That hesitation was a test. Craig failed it immediately. Patience had never been his gift, and desperation had stripped away whatever thin layer of composure he had left. He drove his fist down onto the glass table. The crack rang out across the room. His face went dark red, and every last trace of the strained but measured businessman shattered on the spot. He jabbed a shaking finger at me, his voice climbing into an ugly, entitled bellow. He told me to stop playing games. He said I was 72 years old, with absolutely no use for billions of dollars. He said I was an old man sitting alone in a penthouse while my real family was out there struggling to survive. He leaned in so close, I could see the pulse hammering in his neck, and he spat out the words that sealed his fate for good. He told me I owed them this money, that I owed them for vanishing all those years ago and leaving them to manage on their own. That was the moment, the final drop that sent the water over the rim. He had come to believe his own fabrications. He believed that because I had stayed silent for 15 years, I was weak. He mistook my stillness for surrender. I looked at his red, contorted face, and I no longer saw my son. I saw a parasite that had finally exhausted its hosts. I kept my expression completely neutral, holding back the trap I was about to spring. The tension inside the private boardroom was dense enough to suffocate. Craig was still hunched over the massive glass table, his face flushed with equal parts entitlement and desperation, certain I was about to hand over $2 million to keep his sinking venture afloat. Before I could give him my answer, the heavy double doors of the boardroom blew open with a violent crash. They struck the wall hard enough to send a sound like a gunshot ricocheting through the room. Standing in the doorway, chest heaving, eyes wide and burning with frantic energy, was Ethan. He looked as though he had sprinted the entire distance from his university campus. His heavy backpack slid off his shoulder and dropped to the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He didn't even glance at me, his reddened eyes fixed entirely on his parents. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Craig snapped. His voice dropped a register, scrambling to cloak his raw, exposed desperation beneath the authority of a father. Renata rose immediately, smoothing her silk dress with practiced ease, extending one hand toward him, with a smile that couldn't hold itself steady. Ethan ignored the outstretched hand. He moved further into the room, breathing hard. "My whole life," he said, his voice unsteady but gathering force with every word, "you told me he abandoned us. You told me he ran away with some mistress and emptied our family accounts." Renata's face went pale. She cut a nervous glance toward me, then back to her son. "Sweetheart, please, we can discuss all of this at home. This is not the moment. Your father and I are in the middle of very important business." "Business?" Ethan let out a short, bitter laugh, laced with heartbreak. "You're here begging him for money. The man you told me was a selfish coward. The man you said abandoned us and left us with nothing. I read the articles on my way over here. I looked at the dates. He lost everything the exact same month we moved into that big house in the suburbs. You stole from him. You took everything he had." The oxygen left the room. Craig's face twisted into something ugly and primal. His carefully constructed facade of the struggling but respectable real estate developer collapsed, entirely replaced by a cornered animal with nowhere left to go. "Shut your mouth!" Craig roared. He covered the distance between himself and his son in 2 strides and raised his hand. The slap was deafening. The hard, violent crack of flesh against flesh rang off the high ceiling of the boardroom. Ethan staggered backward, his hand shooting up to his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Renata gasped, but she did not move 1 inch toward her son. She simply stood there, frozen by the collapse of everything she had built on lies. I didn't deliberate. I simply acted. At 72 years old, you might assume my reflexes had dulled, but the protective instinct of a grandfather answers to no age. Before Craig could lift his hand to strike his son a second time, I drove myself between them. I shoved Craig back with a force that startled us both, sending him stumbling into the sharp edge of the glass table. "Do not ever lay a hand on him again," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. The room went utterly still. Craig looked at me, one hand rubbing his chest where I had pushed him. He was breathing heavily, eyes darting in every direction. "You have no right to interfere," he spat, jabbing a trembling finger at me. "He is my son. You do not get to waltz back into our lives after 15 years and tell me how to handle my own child." I held my position, keeping Ethan sheltered behind my shoulder. I could feel the young man tremble, but he didn't move away from me. I looked at the man I had raised. In that precise moment, the last remnant of paternal forbearance drained completely from my soul. The hesitant, remorseful old man they imagined they were manipulating had ceased to exist. Standing in his place was a man who had survived total ruin and constructed a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I looked at Craig, not with anger, but with a cold, surgical clarity. The period of quiet observation was finished. It was time to spring the trap. I straightened the cuffs of my suit jacket, fracturing the tension with a terrifying, deliberate calm. I drew a slow breath and moved my gaze from Craig's flushed, furious face to Renata's pale, covetous eyes. "You are absolutely right," I said, letting the words settle in the air like a stone dropping into still water. I owe you both precisely what you have earned over the past 15 years. Craig's hand gradually lowered. His breathing steadied the instant the word "owe" reached him, triggering the parasitic greed that ran his every calculation. His fury was immediately displaced by his ravenous hunger for my wealth. I returned to my wingback chair, unhurried and composed, and regarded them both. Tomorrow evening, my foundation is hosting its annual charity gala downtown. I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of a man holding every card in the deck. Every major investor, media outlet, and industry leader will be in that room. It is the single most important event of the year for my company. I want you both there. Dress well, arrive on time. Ethan will be attending as my personal guest. Craig shot a quick calculating glance at Renata. He swallowed his earlier rage, dissolving entirely into a starving, eager anticipation. "And the loan?" Craig asked, his voice unsteady with renewed hope. "The $2 million? I held his desperate hollow gaze and gave him a slow, measured nod. "Tomorrow night I will take the stage," I said smoothly. "In front of everyone assembled, I will make my official announcement regarding my successor and the future of my entire fortune. Be there, and you will receive exactly what is coming to you." Craig's eyes ignited with a blinding, toxic ambition. A smug and satisfied smile spread across Renata's face. They genuinely believed they had won. They had taken the bait without a moment's hesitation, completely blind to the fact that they were walking straight into their own undoing. The heavy doors of the boardroom clicked shut, absorbing the frantic, desperate energy Craig had dragged into the room. I was alone again. The silence of the penthouse boardroom settled back in the thick and absolute, a sharp contrast to the raw family wreckage that had just played out inside it. I didn't sink into my wingback chair. I didn't press my fingers to my temples or shed a single tear over what remained of my relationship with my son. That grief had been buried 15 years ago. All that remained now was the cold mechanical precision of a man who had just invited a parasite to its own feast. I reached for the intercom on my desk and pressed the button. "Send Gareth in," I said. My voice was level empty of any residual feeling. Within 60 seconds, the doors opened again. Gareth, my chief legal counsel and head of corporate intelligence, entered the room. He moved with quiet efficiency, his expression a flawless mask of professional detachment. He carried a rigid aluminum briefcase, which he set carefully onto the glass table, right where Craig had slammed his fist only minutes before. "You asked me to dig into his company," Gareth said, snapping the briefcase open. "I didn't just dig Vernon, I brought out the heavy machinery." He withdrew a substantial stack of confidential financial records, bank statements, and court filings, spreading them across the table in a wide arc. I surveyed the mass of documents. Craig had thought he could stride into my office, scatter some industry jargon, and deceive me with a manufactured story about a temporary liquidity crisis. He and his wife had genuinely believed that the man who built a global biotechnology empire from absolute scratch would simply release $2 million without conducting a forensic examination of their affairs. Gareth pressed a manicured finger to a spreadsheet flagged in bright red. "Your son is not simply navigating a market downturn," Gareth said, his tone entirely flat. "He is broke, and frankly, broke would be a considerable upgrade from where he actually stands. Craig is submerged in catastrophic criminal debt." I leaned forward, eyes moving across the heavily annotated documents. "For the past 3 years," Gareth continued, "Craig has been operating his real estate development firm as a personal treasury. He has been systematically pulling funds from his active residential projects to finance a lavish lifestyle, designer, clothing, luxury vehicles, expensive travel, all bankrolled by money that was never his. He built a network of fictitious vendor invoices to disguise the withdrawals, but he grew careless." "But that is not the worst part," Gareth said, drawing a secondary file from the rigid aluminum briefcase. The document carried a federal seal along its top margin. 2 months ago, a group of private investors noticed irregularities in his quarterly reports. They engaged a forensic accounting firm. The auditors uncovered a gaping void in his corporate accounts. Craig has embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He is currently the subject of an active covert investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The pieces locked into place with absolute clarity. The frantic phone calls, the sudden desperate urge to reconnect after 15 years of complete silence. The aggressive demand for precisely $2 million. Craig didn't want my money to fund new properties. He needed an immediate large injection of untraceable cash to quietly fill the hole in his accounts before federal agents came through his front door. He was terrified, cornered, and hunting for a way out. He believed he could use the father he had discarded as a shield against a federal indictment. I let out a low, humorless sound. It was a pathetic, breathtaking kind of arrogance. He had put me out on the street with $150 certain I would simply wither and disappear. Now, staring down the prospect of decades in a federal penitentiary, he expected me to hand over $2 million without question to rescue him from his own greed. He truly believed I was still that same naive, grief-hollowed man from 15 years ago. Gareth gathered the documents, stacking them back neatly into the rigid aluminum briefcase. He looked at me, his expression grave. "We have irrefutable evidence of his financial crimes, Vernon," Gareth said quietly. "The wire transfers the shell companies, the forged signatures. It is all here. Should I contact the authorities now? We can deliver this entire portfolio to the federal investigators and have him in custody before he makes it back to his house." I rose from my seat and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was coming alive, a vast, glittering grid of gold and silver light stretching to the horizon. I stood there looking down at the streets, turning over the charity gala set for tomorrow evening in my mind. I pictured Craig racing home to tell Renata that they had successfully worked the old man, that their salvation was secured. I wanted him to savor that feeling. I wanted him to taste victory on his tongue. I wanted him to sleep well tonight, dreaming of the billions he believed were about to become his. I turned back to Gareth and shook my head, slowly, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving ice. "No," I said. "Do not call the police. Let him put on his expensive suit. Let him walk the red carpet. Let him step onto that stage and feel the weight of a golden crown settling on his head. Because a fall from the bottom step is quickly forgotten, Gareth. I want him to fall from the very top. Only when he is certain he has won everything will we drive him off the edge." The bell above the door of the small corner cafe chimed softly, cutting through the low murmur of the espresso machine. I was seated in a booth near the back, nursing a black tea, watching the entrance. Ethan walked in. He looked completely spent. The heavy bags beneath his eyes and his caved-in posture told the story of a young man whose entire world was splintering apart. He spotted me and threaded his way through the narrow maze of wooden tables. He dropped into the booth across from me, eyes fixed on the scarred tabletop between us. I offered him no warm smile, no reassuring hand on the shoulder. This was not a family reunion. This was an intervention. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and produced a small black flash drive. I set it flat in the center of the table. The metal touched the wood with a faint clink, pulling his gaze downward. I told him that what was stored on that drive was the unvarnished truth about the people who had raised him. I laid it out plainly. His father was not the victim of an ordinary market downturn. Craig had embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He had falsified documents, fabricated vendor accounts, and siphoned stolen funds to sustain a life of pure extravagance. I told Ethan that his parents weren't seeking a family reconciliation. They were hunting for a human shield to place between themselves and a federal indictment. Ethan stared at the black flash drive as though it were a coiled snake. His breathing went shallow. He asked me how they could do something so reckless, how lying came so effortlessly to them, to everyone around them. I looked at my grandson and told him plainly deception was the easiest thing his parents ever did. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man walking home from a cemetery. I had just put my wife, his grandmother, in the ground. That house was supposed to be a place of mourning and quiet comfort. Instead, I climbed the front steps and found the door locked. My key wouldn't turn. I looked through the front window and saw nothing. The living room had been gutted, every stick of furniture, every photograph, every trace of a life lived together, stripped away. I kept my voice perfectly steady as I described the breathless, lurching panic of that afternoon. I told him about the single envelope sitting on the doormat. Inside was exactly $150 in crumpled bills and a handwritten note from his father that said nothing more than "figure it out." They had exploited my grief in its rawest form. They had maneuvered me into signing over my assets while my mind was still fogged with sorrow and medication. They took my home, my savings, my only grandson, and drove away across state lines without once looking back. A heavy, suffocating quiet fell over the small booth. Ethan pressed both hands over his face. His shoulders heaved as he tried to hold back the sobs. The crushing weight of the truth was dismantling him entirely. The life he had admired, the comfort and privilege he had always known, it had all been constructed on the bones of an old man they had left for dead. He whispered that they were monsters. He kept saying it, his voice fracturing with revulsion and heartbreak. I didn't argue with him. I let him grieve. I let the full heat of that betrayal burn away whatever illusions he still carried about his family. It was a brutal thing to watch a young man losing his parents while they were still breathing. But a surgeon doesn't hesitate when cutting away infected tissue. The infection simply had to come out. I waited until his breathing steadied and he finally dragged his sleeve across his eyes. I leaned forward, forearms on the table, and nudged the black flash drive a few inches toward him. I told him that tomorrow night, the entire city would have its eyes on the charity gala. I told him his parents would be seated in the front row, wearing clothes charged to my stolen credit line, waiting to be crowned heirs to my empire. Then I gave him his assignment. I told Ethan that just before I took the stage, he needed to take that flash drive and make his way toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. I told him to find a tall man in a dark gray suit standing near the service doors and to place the drive directly into that man's hand. Ethan looked up at me, eyes red and wide. He asked who the man in the gray suit was. I didn't answer. I simply told him that his entire life his parents had made every choice for him, what he believed, who he trusted, what kind of person he became. But tomorrow night, the choice belonged to him alone. He had to pick a side. He could take the drive walk away and remain with the people who had built their lives on lies and stolen money, or he could hand it over and plant himself on the side of the truth. I lifted my black tea, took a final sip, and rose from the booth. I looked down at the young man sitting beneath the weight of the hardest decision of his life. Ethan reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers wrapping tight around the cold metal of the flash drive. He looked up and gave one slow, definitive nod. The battle lines were drawn. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a glittering expanse of crystal chandeliers and relentless camera flashes. It was the night of my foundation's annual charity gala, the undisputed pinnacle of the city's corporate and social calendar. Down below on the sprawling red carpet that poured into the main hall, a circus of media and high society was already in full swing. The photographers' strobes popped like miniature bursts of lightning, and their light fell perfectly on the centerpiece of my son's arrogance. Craig and Renata stood right in the heart of the media frenzy, bathing in a spotlight they had done absolutely nothing to deserve. They had the look of royalty draped in the kind of extravagance that can only be purchased with someone else's money. Craig wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo that fit him without a single flaw. Renata stood at his side in a breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown, her neck and wrists heavy with diamonds. I knew precisely what those outfits had cost, because the fraud alerts from my corporate credit accounts had been stacking up on my phone all afternoon. They had held nothing back, treating my name and my credit line as a personal bottomless account. They were parading through the spoils of a victory they hadn't yet claimed, entirely blind to the fact that every diamond and every thread of silk was adding another nail to their legal coffin. I stood alone on the curved mezzanine balcony above, tucked into the soft shadows looking down at the spectacle below. The acoustics of the grand hall carried their voices up to me with crisp clarity. A local financial reporter thrust a microphone toward Craig, asking about his sudden arrival in the city and his relationship to my biotech empire. Craig fired back a practiced, disarmingly charming smile. He pulled Renata close with an arm around her waist, projecting the polished image of a devoted family man. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice measured and dripping with manufactured humility. "My father is a brilliant man," Craig said smoothly, sweeping his gaze across the row of reporters. "He has constructed something truly extraordinary here, but age catches up with everyone, and the demands of steering a global company are wearing on him. I am here to step up. I am here to take the reins so he can finally step back and rest. It is my obligation as his son to carry what he has built and to look after him in his later years. He has given so much to this world, now it is time for his family to give something back." Renata nodded at his side, pressing one perfectly manicured hand to her heart, playing the devoted daughter-in-law to flawless perfection. I tightened my grip on the cold marble railing of the balcony. The sheer concentrated poison of his performance was almost breathtaking. He stood there absorbing the press's admiration, casting himself as the devoted heir arriving to shoulder the burden of a tired old man. This was the same man who had handed me $150 and a note telling me to figure it out. This was the man currently in the crosshairs of a federal investigation for embezzling $4 million from his own investors. He was delivering the performance of his life, stacking his pedestal higher and higher, inflating his own legend until it filled every corner of the room. That was precisely what I had intended. I wanted him to feel that intoxicating rush of absolute power. Then a sharp-eyed journalist from a major business publication looked up and caught sight of me standing on the mezzanine. A murmur rolled through the crowd as dozens of heads turned upward. The camera flashes swiveled, and the light found my face in the shadows. Craig followed their gaze and looked up at me. That rehearsed, polished grin cracked just for a heartbeat, something raw and anxious surfacing behind his eyes before he wrestled it back under control and turned the full wattage of his false warmth up at me. Mr. Aldgate, the journalist, called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the grand hall. "Your son just spoke about the future of your company. Will you be stepping down tonight? Are you officially handing over power and naming him as your successor?" Every sound in that room died at once. Hundreds of pairs of eyes swung toward me, among them the hungry, hollow stare of my son and his wife boring into me from the floor below. They had come here expecting a surrender. They believed their scheming had finally paid off, that I was about to hand everything I had built directly into their waiting, thieving grip. I settled my hands on the railing and let my gaze drop straight to Craig. I held the quiet fed, it stretched it until his craving for an answer became almost unbearable to watch. Then I gave him a slow, measured smile, the kind that reveals nothing. Tonight is a very special night. I sent my voice out wide, sharp enough to reach every reporter, every investor, every soul crowded into that hall. It is a night about legacy, about truth, and about the future. I have reached my decision on what becomes of my company and my fortune, and I give you my word before this evening is over. Everything will pass to the one who has genuinely earned it. A wave of excited noise broke through the press corps, pens flying, cameras firing. Down on the floor, Craig's face ignited with a blazing, almost ecstatic joy. Renata exhaled audibly, the tension dissolving from her shoulders, a hollow grin spreading wide. They took my words and ran them through the distorting filter of their own bottomless self-regard. As far as they were concerned, the prize was already theirs. What they could not see was that the stage was set not for their coronation, but their unraveling. The grand velvet curtains swept open, and I moved out onto the main stage of the grand ballroom. The full force of the theatrical lighting crashed over me, bleaching the crowd into a pale, faceless blur, and throwing a stark, almost blinding brilliance across the podium. With every step I took toward the center stage, the low, tangled hum of the room's conversations began to thin and dissolve. Crystal flutes stopped clinking. The whisper of expensive shoes across the floor fell away. What replaced it was a deep, pressing stillness that settled over every corner of that hall like a held breath. The city's elite had been working up to this moment since they'd walked through the doors. I gripped the microphone to adjust it, the metallic rasp cutting sharply through the silence. I gazed out across the audience. The stage lights were brutal. Past the first few rows, people dissolved into darkness and vague outlines. The front row, though, was lit up cold and clear. Craig and Renata stood at its very center, bodies almost flush against the velvet rope dividing the stage from the floor. They were wound so tight they seemed to hum with it. Craig had popped his suit jacket open and rolled his weight onto the balls of his feet like an athlete coiled at the starting line. His eyes hadn't left me wide open, not blinking. A hard little smile of pure arrogance stretched across his jaw. One hand had already drifted up to fidget with his designer silk tie, his body already rehearsing the climb up those stairs to claim what he was certain was his. Beside him, Renata stood shoulder to shoulder, fingers laced tight in front of her sapphire gown, her face arranged into a performance of trembling, adoring loyalty. So swallowed up were they by their own appetite that neither one registered the emptiness behind my gaze, the cold, flat, carved-out look of a man who has already finished the calculation. I brought my mouth close to the microphone, and when I spoke, my voice came out low and even carrying to every last corner of the room. 15 years ago, I said, and then I let those 3 words sit in the air. 15 years ago, I was standing on a bare concrete driveway with nothing to my name except the shirt on my back. No roof over my head, no one beside me. Exactly $150, that was the whole of it. A quiet, absorbed murmur moved through the investors, and journalists packed around the floor. They knew this part of the story. They ate it up every time the self-made visionary clawing up from the rubble of personal ruin to raise a biotechnology empire with his bare hands. In the front row, Craig's smile stretched a little wider. He tilted his head in slow, deliberate nods, performing the devoted son, for the cameras convinced he was watching the warm-up act before his own entrance. What I erected here was built on nothing but the will to survive. I pressed on my eyes, never leaving Craig's face. 15 years of grinding, locking down the future, pushing out breakthroughs that have changed lives, stacking up a fortune that most people can't conceive of. But a real legacy isn't measured by what you accumulate. It comes down to what you leave, and far more than that to whom. The atmosphere inside that hall went taut. Camera flashes strobed in a frantic machine gun rhythm, freezing the moment frame by frame. Craig edged 1 foot forward until his leather shoe met the velvet rope. He was primed. He was listening for 2 syllables his name. "Tonight," I said, and my voice came down, a register sharpened to something almost quiet, almost surgical. "I am announcing the final and permanent disposition of my entire estate, effective immediately 100% of my corporate equity. My voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my personal liquid assets are being permanently transferred into a newly established ironclad legal entity." Craig's chest swelled. He swept a glance across the press corps, already tasting their envy. "I am officially launching the $150 trust," I said, lifting my voice so the name rang out clean. Craig went still. That smug, anticipating smile locked up on his face suddenly frozen. Something genuinely lost moved through his eyes. Across from him, Renata's hands unclasped and drifted down to her sides. This foundation, I continued, raising my voice above the sudden ripple of bewildered murmuring spreading through the crowd, exists for one purpose alone: the protection and restoration of elderly men and women who have been financially destroyed by those they trusted. It will bring the full weight of legal and financial force against the opportunists who feed on the defenseless. Its specific mandate is to pursue and prosecute family members, sons, daughters who exploit, discard, and plunder the very people who sacrificed everything to raise them. The room went utterly suffocatingly quiet. Not a single shutter clicked. The moneyed, powerful faces filling that ballroom stared up at the stage in a kind of paralyzed disbelief. I brought my gaze down to the front row. Every drop of color had left Craig's face. He looked like a man stepping off a ledge and suddenly understanding there was nothing below him. His jaw had slackened, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow pulls. Renata looked 1 degree away from collapse. "I want there to be no ambiguity whatsoever about what this means for my empire," I said, each word placed with the careful, unhurried precision of a blade finding its mark. "This wealth is for the discarded, for the ones who were betrayed. It will stand as a wall between predators and the people they leave out in the cold. No heir will inherit this company. No bloodline will carry forward my fortune. Not a single cent passes to my family." The moment it landed, the room fractured. A single collective gasp tore through hundreds of mouths at once. In the front row, the entire construction, the attentive son, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the loving family portrait came apart in an instant. What crashed over Craig in that moment was total every dollar he had mentally distributed, every future he had designed around inheriting my empire gone vaporized. The public obliteration of everything he'd counted on snapped something loose in him. He threw himself at the velvet rope, seizing it in both fists. His features warped into something ugly and unrecognizable. The cameras meant nothing to him. The room full of the city's most influential people meant nothing. He opened his throat and screamed a raw, ragged sound that bounced off the high walls and filled the hall. He yelled that I had lost my mind. He screamed that I was a senile, crazy old man who had no idea what he was doing. His complexion went deep purple as he drove a trembling finger up at me from the floor, shrieking that I had no right whatsoever to stand on that stage and rob him of what was his. Craig kept on screaming, his face cycling through shades of red, demanding that someone in that room step in and stop me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't signal security. Instead, I slipped one hand into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and closed my fingers around a small black remote. I pointed it toward the control booth at the far end of the room and pressed a single button. The massive digital screen behind me flickered. The corporate logo of my biotechnology firm wiped clean from the display. Something new filled the grand ballroom in its place, a high-definition 30-foot photograph. Not a medical milestone, not architectural plans for a new care facility. What filled that enormous screen was a scrap of yellowed torn paper lying beside a crumpled $100 bill and a single $50 bill. The words written on it had been enlarged until every person in that room could read them without straining. They said, "You will figure it out." I leaned back into the microphone. My voice stayed flat and precise, stripped of any tremor. I told the room to fix their eyes on the screen. What they were looking at, I said, was the bedrock on which my entire billionaire empire had been raised. That crumpled note and those two bills were the generous inheritance my only son saw fit to leave me 15 years ago. A wave of confused, uneasy murmuring moved through the packed hall. I didn't leave them in suspense. I laid out for the entire ballroom exactly what had unfolded during the week. I put my wife in the ground. I described the suffocating fog of grief that had left me barely functional. I told them how Craig, the man standing in that front row performing the role of devoted son, had come to me while I was heavily sedated and hollowed out with loss. He set a pile of papers in front of me and told me they were routine hospital bills and life insurance forms that simply required my signature. I trusted him. I signed every page without reading a single line. Days later, I came back from a walk to find the locks on my own front door had been changed on me. The house had been quietly sold out from under my feet. Craig and his wife had stripped out their belongings, cleared out our joint accounts, and vanished across state lines. They left me on that porch with nothing but the shirt on my back, that pitiful handful of cash, and a cold, handwritten note. The silence that had held the grand ballroom broke apart all at once. A thunderous collective roar of shock and revulsion tore through the crowd, investors, philanthropists, journalists, all of them. The press corps at the foot of the stage understood immediately that they had walked into the biggest corporate scandal anyone had seen in years. As one, they swung their cameras away from the podium and trained them on the front row. A blinding, relentless barrage of flashes caught Craig full in the face. He lurched backward, throwing both hands up against the light. Every trace of his composed, polished bearing collapsed in an instant. He looked like a cornered creature, shaking his head and muttering to himself. The powerful figures who minutes before had been pumping his hand and raising glasses to his future now peeled away. They drew back until a broad, empty ring had formed around Craig and his wife, as though proximity to them had become something to be avoided. Craig tried to get words out, tried to mount some kind of defense, but the crowd was already talking over him. The humiliation was complete and suffocating. The glittering coronation he had pictured all evening had curdled into a public execution broadcast to every camera in the room. Each lie he'd fed the press earlier that night was now tightening around his throat. Renata watched their entire future reduce itself to cinders in a matter of seconds. The understanding that not a single cent of a billion-dollar fortune was coming their way hit her, followed immediately by the cold terror of being destroyed in public. The carefully built image of the warm, devoted daughter-in-law dissolved on the spot. Raw, unhinged panic seized her completely. She lunged with a sudden violent burst of motion. She tore a microphone straight from the grip of a stunned financial reporter standing near the velvet rope. She locked both hands around it, knuckles draining white, and screamed into the device. Her voice shrieked out across the grand speakers and ricocheted off the high ceilings. She called me a liar. She drove her finger toward the stage, her breathing ragged and wild. She told the crowd they were hearing the ramblings of a senile, crazy old man who was inventing stories for attention. She scrambled to build a counter-narrative on the fly, shouting that I was the one who had walked out on them. She claimed I had emptied the family accounts and disappeared with a mistress, leaving her and Craig to scrape by in poverty. She begged the journalists to put their cameras down. She pleaded with the investors to disregard every word I had spoken. She was unraveling in real time, spinning a web of desperate, fabricated lies. She drew breath to hurl another accusation, to cast herself as the one wronged in all of this. But before a single syllable escaped her, another voice cut straight through the noise. It was young Raw, with barely contained emotion, and the ballroom sound system carried it into every corner of the hall. The camera flashes died all at once. Every head in that grand room, including Renata's and Craig's, turned from the stage toward the heavy service doors at the back. The shrieking echo of Renata's fabricated outrage into the microphone was suddenly swallowed by something else. Those heavy wooden service doors at the far end of the grand ballroom blew open with a concussive boom that shuddered through the floorboards. Every camera flash cut out. Hundreds of investors and journalists pivoted in unison. Making his way down the long center aisle, caught in the full glow of the crystal chandeliers overhead, was Ethan. My 22-year-old grandson looked nothing like the rattled college student who had sat across from me in that small corner cafe just 24 hours earlier. His shoulders were squared and set. His jaw was locked. He moved with the kind of deliberate loaded weight that belongs to someone who has already decided what they're going to do. He was walking straight for the brightly lit stage, and he was not slowing down. Renata went rigid. She stood near the velvet rope, still clutching the stolen microphone, her face drained and slick with nervous sweat. She stared at her son as though something impossible had just stepped through the door. Craig, still reeling from the wreckage of his public exposure, turned and found Ethan's eyes across the room. Craig demanded to know what he was doing there. He ordered Ethan to get out, told him to go back to the hotel and keep himself out of adult affairs. He was reaching for whatever shred of parental authority he still possessed, trying to salvage the last crumbling fragment of control he had left. But the words landed on nothing. Ethan didn't slow his pace. He didn't look at his father. His gaze was locked entirely on his mother. He reached the edge of the stage, stepped directly over the velvet rope, without breaking stride. The security guards, too stunned by the spectacle unfolding around them, made no move to stop him. He walked straight up to Renata. She tried to arrange her face into something resembling a reassuring motherly smile. She stretched out a shaking hand and told him to speak up, to tell all these people the old man was lying. She implored him to back her version, to tell the press how much the two of them had endured. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and pulled the microphone directly from her damp, trembling grip. He raised it to his mouth, and his voice filled the vast, silent ballroom. He looked his mother square in the eye and told her to close her mouth. A collective gasp ripped through the room. Reporters scrambled to bring their cameras back up, capturing every agonizing frame of this family coming apart at the seams. Renata stumbled back as though she'd taken a physical blow. Ethan turned away from her and faced the wall of journalists. He didn't hesitate for a breath. He spoke the plain, unvarnished truth. He gave his name to the microphone and stated that everything that had just been revealed was entirely accurate. He told the packed, silent room that his entire life he had been fed a slow, corrosive lie. His parents had told him his grandfather was a coward who had gutted the family savings and run. Ethan paused, his voice unsteady with emotion, but his resolve absolute. He leveled a finger at Craig. He told the crowd his father was a thief and a fraud. He said that just one day earlier, he had uncovered the truth of what had really happened. He told them how his parents had left his grandfather on a doorstep with exactly $150 and nothing else. He explained how they had fled the state and erected their fraudulent life of luxury on the back of a grieving old man. Ethan turned to the investors in the front row and told them his parents hadn't come to this gala to honor any legacy. They had come to pillage whatever remained of it, because their own real estate operation was completely bankrupt. They had come to use a 72-year-old man as a human shield against their own catastrophic crimes. The grand ballroom dissolved into total, absolute chaos. Journalists fired questions over each other in a deafening tangle of voices. Investors yanked out their phones, frantically calling their financial advisors to pull every dollar of backing they had with Craig. The public reckoning was complete and flawless. Renata buried her face in her hands and sobbed as the reality of prison and poverty came crashing in. But Craig didn't weep. Whatever last thread of sanity he had been holding on to snapped entirely. The son he had shaped, the boy he had kept under his thumb his whole life, had just plunged a knife through his public standing in front of the most powerful room in the city. Blind, consuming rage took over. He let out a feral, unhinged scream that tore through the noise of the crowd. He dropped his head and charged the stage like a rabid animal. He vaulted the velvet rope, his eyes locked on Ethan and nothing else. He pulled his fist back, loaded to deliver a savage, crushing blow to his own son, to beat him into silence, to punish him for dismantling everything. He wanted to destroy the one who had spoken the truth. But in his fury, he had completely forgotten who else was standing on that stage. Before this night reaches its turning point, and trust me, what is about to happen in that ballroom will cost someone everything, I want to ask you something. If you had spent years quietly building your case against someone who betrayed you at your worst moment, would you confront them the moment you had the proof, or would you wait until the room was full and the doors were locked? I didn't wait for security. I didn't flinch. Decades of clawing through hardship had forged my instincts into something close to iron. As Craig lunged toward Ethan, I moved directly into his path. I planted my feet and drove both hands hard into the center of his chest. The raw momentum of his charge met the immovable force of a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Craig lost his footing completely. He stumbled back in a violent, flailing spiral, arms windmilling at empty air. Before he could recover, the Grand Hotel's elite security team swarmed the stage. 6 heavily built guards in dark suits closed in from every direction. They took Craig down hard, seizing his arms and shoulders and driving him face first into the polished hardwood floor. The sickening crack of the impact rang through the microphone Ethan had dropped on the stage. Craig thrashed and kicked screaming profanities into the floorboards, while the guards wrenched his wrists painfully behind his back. Every trace of the charming, polished businessman had been stripped away, leaving a restrained, humiliated criminal flattened in front of the entire world. The total destruction of my son was going out live to millions of viewers. But the evening wasn't finished. The final crushing blow was still waiting in the wings. Through the blinding camera strobes and the churning crowd, the space parted once more, making way for the ultimate consequence. The thud of Craig hitting the hardwood floor still resonated through the silent ballroom. 6 large security guards had him locked completely down. His arms were bent painfully behind his back, his expensive charcoal tuxedo bunching and tearing under the weight of the men pressing him to the floor. He was writhing like something trapped, his face mashed against the stage, pulling for breath in short, shallow gasps. The crowd below had gone utterly still. Wealthy investors, philanthropists, journalists, all of them simply stood and stared at the spectacular implosion of a man who had believed himself untouchable. From the shadows of the backstage wings, a figure stepped out. It was Gareth, my chief legal counsel. He didn't hurry. He moved at the calm, deliberate pace of a man who already knows how the ending reads. His face carried no feeling whatsoever, a mask of precise, chilling composure. In his right hand, he gripped a thick, heavy manila folder. The stage lights caught the bold red lettering stamped across the cover. Gareth stepped over the dropped microphone and came to a stop directly in front of where Craig was pinned to the floor. Craig twisted his neck upward, his face red and sheened with sweat, a sudden creeping terror spreading across his eyes. He looked from Gareth to the folder and seemed to recognize in an instant the fatal weight of whatever lay inside it. Gareth showed him not a shred of pity. He simply released the folder. It hit the floor with a heavy, satisfying slap right beside my son's sweating face. Several loose documents fanned out across the hardwood, caught perfectly under the harsh stage lighting. The journalists pressed against the front row, leaned in immediately, their camera lenses zooming tight on every page. They captured every single detail, including the undeniable federal seal printed at the top of the forensic accounting report. Gareth crouched slightly and retrieved the microphone Ethan had dropped moments before. A single tap confirmed it was still live, the sound booming out across the cavernous grand hall. He looked down at my son and spoke with a cold, surgical precision that sliced cleanly through the remaining noise in the room. He told Craig that he had walked into my private boardroom just 24 hours earlier, aggressively demanding a $2 million loan to rescue his failing real estate operation. Gareth's voice was perfectly level, carrying over the massive speakers without a tremor. He told the entire room that the story about a temporary market downturn was pure fabrication from start to finish. He directed their attention to the scattered documents and announced that the forensic audit inside that folder proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Craig had embezzled $4 million from his own private investors. The gasp from the audience hit like a wave. Investors who had been toasting with Craig less than an hour ago physically recoiled. Several yanked out their phones on the spot, dialing their financial teams to sever every remaining connection to his collapsing firm. The journalists fired off rapid bursts of photographs, capturing the bank statements spread across the floor, the shell companies, the forged vendor invoices. The whole brazen architecture of fraud laid bare. The financial scheme was no longer hidden. It was a live televised spectacle. Craig stopped fighting the guards. The resistance drained entirely out of him, replaced by a deep, paralyzing dread. His eyes moved frantically across the documents scattered near his face. He saw the highlighted bank transfers. He saw the precise dates the funds had been stolen. The arrogant fury that had driven him to charge his own son dissolved completely. He was no longer a raging man demanding deference. He was a cornered, broken criminal who had just understood there was nowhere left to go. Down in the front row, Renata dropped to her knees. She clutched her sapphire gown, openly weeping as the full scale of their ruin crashed over her. She understood that the lavish life they had constructed on stolen money was finished. No mansion, no luxury cars, no billionaire inheritance, only the crushing weight of total inescapable poverty and the long shadow of a federal penitentiary. Then a new sound broke through the heavy stillness of the grand ballroom. It began as a faint, distant wail threading through the city streets outside, but it built steadily, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. It was the sharp, unmistakable sound of approaching police sirens. The wailing multiplied as multiple patrol cars and federal transport vehicles converged on the luxury hotel. The sound pushed through the thick walls and heavy glass of the ballroom, ringing in the ears of my son. Pure, undiluted panic seized him in an instant. He started thrashing under the guards again, twisting, bucking, kicking, in a desperate and pathetic bid to find any way out. He screamed that it was a setup, that the documents were forged, but his voice broke apart with raw, unconcealed fear. He fought against the hands pinning him down and threw his gaze wildly toward the rear exit, clawing for an escape from a trap that had already closed completely around him. The sirens outside climbed to a deafening pitch, sending vibrations through the crystal chandeliers overhead. The heavy brass handles of the main ballroom doors turned, and the great wooden panels swung wide open. The restless murmur of the wealthy crowd died in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, taut silence. A wave of uniformed police officers flooded into the grand hall and spread out to cover every exit. But they weren't the ones at the front of the advance. Walking ahead of the uniformed officers were four men in sharp, immaculate, dark gray suits. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision, their faces wiped clean of anything resembling emotion. Clipped to their belts and hanging from lanyards at their chests were the unmistakable gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I recognized every one of them. These were the precise men I had pointed out to Ethan earlier in the evening. The men who had been stationed by the service doors. The men who now held the black flash drive, carrying every piece of evidence needed to bury my son in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The crowd peeled away from them, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Billionaires, philanthropists, and jostling journalists practically climbed over each other to clear a wide path. The federal agents didn't spare a glance for the cameras or the glittering guests. Their eyes were locked straight ahead, moving in an unwavering line directly toward the stage where Craig was still pinned to the hardwood floor. Craig twisted his head cheek, dragging across the polished wood, trying to make out who was approaching. When he saw the gold badges burning under the stage lights, the last fraction of resistance left his body. His shoulders caved, and a low, pathetic sound escaped his throat. He looked past the agents and found Ethan standing near the edge of the stage. Understanding hit him like something physical. He knew at last exactly whose hands Ethan had placed that flash drive into. The betrayal he felt in that moment ran deep, but it was nothing compared to what he had done to me 15 years ago. The lead agent stepped up onto the stage, his polished shoes pressing over the forensic accounting documents Gareth had spilled across the floor moments before. He signaled to the hotel security guards. The guards stepped back and hauled Craig up to his knees. The federal agent looked down at my son and drew a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He read the charges out loud in a booming voice that carried to every corner of the room. Wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud investors of $4 million. Every single word landed like a fresh blow, dismantling the fraudulent empire Craig had spent years assembling. While the agent read Craig his rights, my attention was pulled downward by a sudden, desperate movement. Renata had been kneeling in the front row, frozen solid by the scale of their public destruction. But as the concrete reality of a federal prison materialized directly before her eyes, that frozen stillness cracked open into raw, unhinged terror. She understood that the stolen corporate credit cards, the designer wardrobe, and the luxury cars were all gone. She understood her freedom was draining away in real time. She scrambled forward, her expensive sapphire silk dress snagging and tearing on the leg of a stray camera tripod. She clawed her way to the edge of the stage, tears cutting through her meticulously applied makeup. Her face was a twisted mask of pure panic. She reached up over the velvet rope and seized my pant leg with both hands. Her grip was trembling violently, diamond rings catching the harsh stage lights as her fingers dug into the fabric of my suit. "Dad!" She sobbed, her voice splintering into a shrill, hysterical pitch. Dad, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can give the money back. Please do not let them take us away. We are family. You have to save us. We are your family." She looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, appealing to the very man she had mocked and robbed just a few hours before. She expected the soft, forgiving old grandfather to somehow materialize and pull her back from the edge of the consequences her own appetite had created. She genuinely believed the word family still carried any currency between us. I looked down at the woman who had helped engineer my ruin. I looked at the hands that had cheerfully packed up my belongings while I was in the depths of mourning my wife. I felt no anger in that moment. I felt no pity. What I felt was nothing, only the cold, clean precision of justice. I didn't stoop to comfort her. I offered no word of reassurance. I met her eyes, and with a slow, unhurried motion, I drew my leg back and let her trembling hands slide off my suit. She pitched forward slightly, her palms meeting the cold floor of the stage. I looked down at her tear-streaked, broken face. I leaned in just slightly, making sure my voice was pitched low enough for only her and Craig to catch, but sharp enough to pass straight through them. I looked at the two people who had dismantled my past, and I handed them their future. "You will figure it out," I said, the exact words from that yellowed note 15 years ago, the precise phrase they had used to deliver me to a life on the streets. Hearing those words return to her in that hall shattered whatever remained of Renata's composure. She crumpled against the velvet rope face buried in her hands, sobbing in absolute, inescapable despair as the federal agents pulled her husband to his feet and locked the steel cuffs firmly around his wrists. The sharp metallic snap of the handcuffs closing around my son's wrists rang out over the fading wail of the sirens outside. That small mechanical sound seemed to sever the last remaining thread holding his sanity together. Craig did not drop his head in defeat. He did not take what was coming with any measure of quiet dignity. Instead, a violent, desperate survival reflex seized control of his entire body. He wrenched his upper torso sharply, fighting against the firm hold of the federal agents on his arms, and turned his furious, bloodshot eyes directly on his wife. Renata was still slumped against the thick velvet rope, her sapphire gown torn and ruined, dark mascara running in streaks down her pale face. Craig looked at the woman he had partnered with to destroy my life, and without a moment's pause, he threw her completely under the bus. He screamed at the federal agents, his voice splintering with panic. He demanded they arrest her immediately. He yelled that he was not the mastermind, that Renata was the one who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. He jerked his cuffed hands awkwardly in her direction and shouted that she was the one who had forced him to sell my house 15 years ago. He told the stunned gathering of investors and journalists that Renata was the one who forged the legal documents and manipulated the power of attorney, while I was heavily medicated and deep in grief over my late wife. The sheer raw scale of the betrayal pouring out of him was something to witness. He was entirely prepared to sacrifice the mother of his child if it bought him even a single month off his federal prison sentence. Hearing those accusations, Renata stopped crying at once. Her despair curdled instantly into a venomous, concentrated rage. The composed society wife dissolved on the spot, replaced by a cornered predator with nothing left to protect. She hauled herself up off the hardwood floor, ignoring the torn silk of her dress, and drove herself directly toward her husband. A hotel security guard had to move fast, planting himself firmly in her path and catching her by the shoulders to stop her from raking her nails across my son's face. She screamed right back at him, her voice ragged and completely unhinged. She told the federal agents to disregard every syllable out of his mouth. She yelled that Craig was a pathological liar, a coward, and a degenerate. She threw her voice over the churning noise of the ballroom, announcing to every journalist and elite investor within earshot that Craig had personally driven his real estate firm into the ground through his own catastrophic incompetence. She screamed that he hadn't lost the money in any bad market, that he had burned every single cent of it on illegal offshore gambling and a mountain of hidden debts. She frantically told the entire room that she had only gone along with the recent credit card fraud because Craig had bankrupted their family and threatened to abandon her with absolutely nothing. The immaculate, carefully constructed facade of their happy, successful marriage was torn to pieces in front of hundreds of camera lenses. It was an absolute bloodbath of mutual destruction. There they stood under the full glare of the stage lights, savagely dismantling each other, voluntarily confessing to serious federal crimes, just to ensure the other one went down alongside them. They were like two drowning rats stepping on each other's heads just to grab one more breath of air. The federal agents had no need to interrogate either of them. They simply stood back and allowed the two of them to scream their full confessions into the open air, while the journalists captured every damning syllable. The microphones collected every accusation and sent their toxic greed out to the entire world. The lead agent finally gave a sharp, definitive nod. Two officers stepped forward, took hold of Renata by the arms, pulled her hands firmly behind her back, and snapped a second pair of steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She kicked and thrashed heels slipping across the polished floor, still hurling profanities at her husband. Craig kept shouting over her, loudly begging the agents for a plea deal, promising to testify against his wife, as they physically dragged him backward down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The gathered guests drew apart at once. Billionaires, industry leaders, and members of the press watched in horrified silence as the two people who had swept in that evening, looking like corporate royalty, were hauled out like rabid animals. The massive wooden doors of the grand hall slammed shut behind them with a heavy, definitive thud, cutting off their frantic, pathetic screaming all at once. The bright strobing of the cameras slowly wound down. The chaotic, pressurized energy drained rapidly from the room, leaving in its place a profound and settled stillness. I stood motionless at the center of the stage, looking out over a silent, stunned crowd. I looked down at Gareth, my lawyer, who offered me a slow, deeply respectful nod. I looked across to Ethan, my grandson, who stood staring blankly at the closed wooden doors, quietly working through the permanent, irreversible end of the life he'd known. The grand hall was entirely quiet. The suffocating storm had finally passed. The war I had waged in total silence was officially finished. My empire was fully secured, and the order of my life had been cleanly restored. The deafening chaos of the grand ballroom had evaporated completely. The flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the federal agents leading my son away in steel handcuffs. All of it gone. What remained was the glittering wreckage of a shattered evening, broken champagne flutes, abandoned cocktail napkins, and the trampled pages of the forensic accounting report were scattered across the expensive hardwood floor. The elite guests had cleared out as fast as their luxury town cars could take them, wanting no part of the toxic fallout from my family's spectacular public collapse. I stood near the edge of the stage, the heavy silence settling around me, and looked out across the vast, empty hall. There, huddled in the dark shadows of the grand sweeping staircase, was Ethan. My 22-year-old grandson had completely collapsed. He was sitting on the bottom marble step, elbows propped on his knees, face pressed deep into his hands. His shoulders heaved with silent, violent sobs. He had just watched federal agents drag his mother and father out of that building to face decades behind bars. He had stood before the entire world and permanently torn apart the only family he had ever known. I understood precisely what was bearing down on him in that moment. It wasn't simply the trauma of the betrayal. It was the suffocating, terrifying weight of his new reality closing in. An hour earlier, he had been the privileged heir to a sprawling real estate fortune, a young man who had never once lost a sleep over a credit card bill or a tuition payment. Now he was the son of two convicted felons. His surname was indelibly marked by the ugly stain of a massive federal fraud scandal. The imaginary trust fund his parents had dangled in front of him all his life was gone, without a trace, replaced by a mountain of student loan debt that now belonged entirely to him. He had nothing, and he was completely alone. A younger, softer version of me might have crossed that floor and sat down beside him on those steps. I might have told him it was going to be fine, that I'd handle it, that I'd write a check large enough to make the pain disappear. But the hard years had taught me that protecting a young man from the full weight of consequence doesn't build him. It hollows him out. That kind of blind, unconditional financial cushioning was exactly the poison that had shaped his father into the man he became. I was not about to repeat that mistake. A few yards away, a hotel janitor had cautiously emerged from the service corridor. He was gripping a wide floor mop, glancing around with uncertainty, unsure whether the room was cleared for cleaning yet. I walked over to the young worker, reached out, and quietly took the wooden mop handle from his grasp. I turned and moved slowly across the debris-strewn floor, my shoes clicking against the hardwood, with each deliberate step, until I was standing directly in front of my grandson. Ethan did not look up. He just kept crying, entirely consumed by his own devastating grief. I didn't lower myself to his level. I didn't offer a soft word of comfort. I held the mop out and let it drop. The wooden handle struck the marble steps with a sharp clatter, landing just inches from his expensive leather shoes. Ethan flinched, pulling his hands back from his tear-streaked face. He stared down at the mop handle, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, red and swollen and full of pure bewilderment. "You did a very brave thing tonight, Ethan," I said, my voice level and carrying the kind of weight that didn't invite argument. "You stood before the world and chose truth over a comfortable, profitable lie. I respect you for that. But weeping on the floor of a luxury hotel is not going to retire your student loans. It is not going to put food on your table, and it is certainly not going to rebuild a reputation that was just buried in front of every camera in this city." Ethan stared at me, his breathing stuttering in his chest. He was waiting for me to rescue him. He expected a billionaire grandfather to produce a checkbook and dissolve the terrifying uncertainty that now surrounded his entire future. I held his gaze and dismantled that expectation without hesitation. "The illusion of your wealth died tonight," I told him, sweeping a hand toward the empty, littered ballroom around us. "Your parents spent their whole lives trying to steal their way to the top because they were fundamentally too afraid of hard work to earn it honestly. They taught you how to fill out an expensive suit, and they taught you to carry yourself like you were above everyone else in the room, but they never once taught you how to actually survive. That ends now. Pick up the mop, Ethan. Start working on this mess. Honest labor has a way of clearing a man's head." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I watched the struggle move across his young, tear-stained face in real time. His eyes went from the mop to the vast, daunting wreckage spread across the ballroom floor and back again. For one long, unsettling moment, I thought he was going to refuse. I thought the entitlement his parents had spent years hammering into him was going to win out over any desire to become something different. But then Ethan dragged the back of his sleeve across his face. He pulled in a long, unsteady breath, leaned down and wrapped both hands around the wooden mop handle. He pushed himself to his feet, squared himself in front of the debris, and took his first step forward. It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do, and it was the very first true lesson in self-reliance that his parents had never once thought to give him. The morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. A taxi rolled to the curb, and Ethan climbed out looking wrung out but surprisingly clear-eyed. He had spent the entire night working through the wreckage of the grand ballroom. That hours-long physical labor had scoured away the last residue of his entitled upbringing. He walked up the short gravel driveway and stopped, looking around in quiet disbelief. He was standing in front of my actual home, not a sprawling estate, not a glass-walled penthouse. A solid, unpretentious wooden house tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The lawn was neatly kept. The front porch was modest, and the clapboard was painted a calm shade of gray. This was the life I had constructed for myself, well away from the blinding lights and corrosive greed of the corporate world. I was sitting in the wooden rocking chair, a mug of black tea warming my hands, watching my grandson make his way up the path. Ethan climbed the 3 porch steps and stood before me. He bore no trace of the arrogant air his parents had spent years engineering. He looked like a young man who had just surfaced from a long, suffocating nightmare. He kept his eyes on the floorboards for a stretch before finally looking up. His voice carried the weight of genuine shame as he spoke. He told me he was deeply sorry for everything his parents had done. He apologized for living comfortably on money that had been taken from me and for never once questioning the lies he'd been fed his entire life. I took a measured sip of my tea and gave a slow nod. I told him an apology was a reasonable place to start, but words cost a man nothing. Real character, I said, is constructed from what he does after he's finished apologizing. Ethan swallowed hard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He told me his entire life had been upended beyond recognition. With his parents staring down federal prison sentences and every asset they owned frozen by the government, he was left with absolutely nothing. His university tuition was severely past due, and he was carrying a crushing load of debt his father had quietly taken out in his name. His voice wavered slightly as he worked up to the question I'd known was coming. He asked if I could lend him some money, just enough to cover his most pressing debts and keep him from losing his campus apartment. He promised to repay every cent once he graduated and landed a steady job. I didn't pause to consider it. I set my tea down on the small side table beside the rocking chair. I looked him directly in the eye and told him absolutely not. I would not be putting a single cent of cash in his hands. Ethan's face fell as though I'd struck him. He started to open his mouth to argue perhaps, or to plead, but I raised one hand and stopped him before a word could escape. I told him that handing over raw cash was the identical mistake I had made with his father. Blind financial cushioning, I explained, was a slow-acting poison. It had transformed his father into a lazy, entitled criminal who had convinced himself the world was obligated to provide for him. I told Ethan I cared about him too much to pass that same disease on to him. I was not going to write a rescue check and strip him of the chance to discover what he was actually made of. I reached down beside the rocking chair and lifted a plain manila folder from the floor. I extended it toward him. Ethan took it with unsteady hands and opened it. Inside was a legally binding contract I had drawn up with Gareth early that morning. I laid out the terms plainly and without softening them. My foundation would pay his university tuition directly to the school, not a cent of it would pass through his personal account. In exchange for that support, he was required to work 20 hours a week as a clerk at the $150 trust. He would be filing paperwork, answering phones, and working directly alongside the elderly victims his parents had treated with such contempt. I told him he would earn a standard hourly wage, and that specific wage would cover his own rent, his own food, and his own debts. No luxury vehicles, no designer labels, and not a single free ride. Ethan read through the document carefully. I watched his face bracing for the toxic pride his mother had drilled into him to suddenly rear its head. I waited to see if he would fling the folder aside and storm off insulted by the prospect of working with his hands, but he didn't. A deep, overwhelming calm settled across his tired features. His entire life, his parents had wielded money like a weapon, buying his loyalty, manipulating his choices, keeping him snugly trapped inside their web of deceit. This contract was something else entirely. It was honest, unsparing, an unforgiving boundary drawn in ink. It was a genuine chance to make his own way. Ethan lifted his eyes from the page, his head straight, a quiet new resolve burning in his expression. He asked me for a pen. I reached into my shirt pocket and handed him the gold pen. He pressed the folder against the wooden porch railing and signed his name at the bottom without a moment's pause. The line was drawn. The foundation for something real was finally in place. 6 months rolled past with the relentless momentum of a freight train that nothing could slow. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, cutting off the frenzied noise of the press corps crowding the marble front steps. The courtroom was filled to absolute capacity. Journalists, former investors, curious onlookers all gathered to witness the closing chapter of the city's most notorious family betrayal. I settled into the polished wooden chair of the witness stand, calmly adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Across the wide aisle at the stark metal defense table sat Craig and Renata. They bore no resemblance to the arrogant corporate royalty who had paraded down a red carpet 6 months prior. The bespoke suits and sapphire gowns were gone, swapped out for dull, oversized, standard-issue prison jumpsuits. Craig looked utterly hollowed out. His posture had caved in on itself. His skin was pale, his eyes skittering nervously around the imposing room. I looked at him and felt nothing, not 1 ounce of pity. Not a surge of fury either, only the pristine, freezing clarity of a man delivering consequences that were long, long overdue. The prosecuting attorney approached the stand and asked me to state my name for the official record. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke with cold, unwavering precision. For the next 2 hours, I answered every question put to me. I traced the exact timeline of their deceit, from start to finish, without a single tear, without a tremor in my voice, without any crack in my composure. The defense attorney came at me hard, working to frame me as a vindictive billionaire, nursing a petty grudge, but I was absolute iron. I would not give my son the satisfaction of watching me break. I laid out the cold facts of his betrayal and let the sheer brutality of what he had done speak entirely for itself. The prosecutor then turned from the defense table and crossed toward the jury box, signaling the clerk to bring up the evidence projector. He didn't stop at the $4 million embezzlement that had drawn federal agents to the gala. He went far deeper. He pulled up documents stretching back 15 years. The glowing screen behind the judge lit up with the original deed to my old suburban home, displayed side by side with the power of attorney paperwork authorizing the secret sale. A verified forensic analysis of the signatures followed microscopic, meticulous, and devastating. The forgery was beyond dispute. I explained to that silent, breathless courtroom exactly how Craig had engineered the theft. I described how he had slipped those specific pages into a thick stack of hospital bills and insurance forms, while I lay heavily medicated, completely numb, deep in grief over the death of my late wife. I watched the 12 jurors as the full weight of his actions settled over them. Several physically recoiled, their faces twisting in undisguised disgust. They saw the calculated predatory forgery from 15 years back set perfectly alongside fresh bank statements showing his stolen investor funds. The full staggering architecture of his greed was laid bare for the world to see. He had been a ruthless thief his entire adult life, stealing first from a grieving father, then from the people who had foolishly placed their trust in his business. Craig sank lower in his chair, unable to face the screen, unable to face the jury, and entirely unable to face me. The trial did not drag on. The paper trail was far too crushing, the digital evidence far too damning for any serious debate. When the jury foreman rose to read the verdict, the tension in the room was so thick it pressed down like a physical weight. Guilty on all charges. The words moved through that silent courtroom like a heavy steel vault door slamming shut for good. The federal judge, a stern, unyielding woman with zero patience for white-collar crime, did not restrain herself at sentencing. She looked directly down from the bench at Craig and Renata, her voice cutting through the room with sharp, unmistakable disdain. She condemned what they had done as a sickening display of profound moral bankruptcy, noting that they had turned family trust into a financial weapon for their own selfish ends. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, ringing crack. 15 years in a federal penitentiary for each of them. 15 years. A perfectly poetic, devastating symmetry. 1 year behind bars for every year I had spent hauling my life back from the ashes they had left me in. Craig did not cry out. He didn't scream or thrash against the bailiffs the way he had at the charity gala. He simply dropped his head, his forehead coming to rest against the cold metal of the defense table. His shoulders gave way as the crushing reality finally broke through. The terrible arithmetic of his own greed was working itself out behind his eyes. He had discarded a guaranteed inheritance, a billion-dollar biotechnology empire. He had thrown away wealth beyond anything he could have imagined, all because he lacked the patience and the basic character to earn $2 million honestly. He had surrendered his freedom, driven away his only son, and obliterated his entire future for absolutely nothing. The silence held over the courtroom as the bailiffs moved forward. They took Craig by the arms and pulled him to his feet. He threw one last broken glance back toward the witness stand, but I was already turning away perfectly at peace with the justice that had finally arrived. The visitor room of the federal penitentiary was a masterpiece of sterile, soul-draining design. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing everything in a sickly pale hue across rows of scratched plastic chairs and thick reinforced plexiglass dividers. I sat perfectly still in my designated seat and waited. I felt no anxiety. My pulse was as even as the ticking of a grandfather clock. I hadn't come to offer forgiveness or to find closure. I was there to put a final definitive period at the end of a very long sentence. The heavy steel door on the far side of the room buzzed and clicked open. A correctional officer led my son into the visitor area. I watched Craig walk toward the glass, and for one fleeting moment it was hard to reconcile the man in front of me with the polished, arrogant real estate mogul from 6 months ago. The bespoke charcoal tuxedo had been replaced by an oversized faded khaki jumpsuit. His posture was completely broken, his shoulders turned inward, his hair thinning and unkempt, going gray heavily at the temples. The suffocating weight of a 15-year federal sentence had aged him a full decade in just a few short months. He dropped heavily onto the metal stool on his side of the glass. With trembling hands, he reached out and lifted the black plastic telephone receiver. I mirrored him, bringing the handset to my ear. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the line, nothing except the harsh, uneven sound of his breathing. He looked at me through the smudged plexiglass eyes, red and bloodshot. "It's Dad!" He whispered, his voice breaking apart. "Thank you for coming. I did not think you would ever want to see me again." I stayed completely silent, letting his words hang in the sterile air between us. The silence pushed him forward, forcing him to keep talking to fill the void with whatever performance he had rehearsed alone in his cell. He leaned toward the glass and pressed his forehead against the barrier. "I am so sorry," he choked out, his voice soaked in desperate, pathetic sorrow. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my company, my wife, my son. I sit in that cell every single night thinking about what I did to you. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am." I listened to every word of his apology. It rang completely hollow, empty of any genuine remorse. It was the apology of a man sorry he had been caught, not a man grieving the pain he had inflicted. I kept my face a mask of pure stone, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. When he understood that his tearful display wasn't going to penetrate my armor, he wiped his eyes and shifted his posture. The sorrow evaporated, replaced without delay by a familiar creeping urgency. His fundamental parasitic nature could only stay concealed for so long. "It is so hard in here, Dad." He continued, his tone gliding smoothly from remorseful to plaintive. "The food is completely inedible. The conditions are terrible. I have absolutely nothing left. They stripped every one of my accounts. Ethan won't even respond to my letters. I am completely alone." He paused, swallowing hard, and fixed me with a hungry, desperate look. "I was wondering," he stammered, "if you could do me one small favor. Just a little deposit into my prison commissary account. Enough to get some decent food and basic supplies. You have billions, Dad. A few hundred would mean nothing to you, but it would change everything for me in here." There it was. The plain, undeniable truth of the man my son had become. Even after losing everything he had, even after receiving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive financial fraud, his very first impulse upon seeing the father he had betrayed was to ask for a handout. The greed was a terminal condition embedded deep in his DNA. I didn't raise my voice at him. I didn't call out his breathtaking audacity. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small silver money clip. Slowly and deliberately, I slid 2 specific bills free from beneath the metal clip. I held them up close to the thick plexiglass, angling them so he could see them clearly under the harsh fluorescent light. 1 crisp $100 bill and 1 crisp $50 bill. Craig stopped his whining. He stared at the money brow, furrowing in bewilderment. He watched as I folded the bills together neatly. I leaned forward and fed them through the narrow metal transaction slot at the base of the heavy glass divider. The folded bills slid through to his side and came to rest quietly on the metal ledge. Craig looked down at the money. Then he looked back up at me, his eyes moving frantically, searching my face for an explanation. "Why?" he asked, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Why exactly 150? I kept the black plastic receiver pressed firmly to my ear. "Because, Craig," I said, my voice frozen and perfectly level, "that is exactly what you left me." I watched the realization strike him like a physical blow. I watched his mind snap back 15 years to a cold, empty driveway. He remembered the locks changed on the doors. He remembered loading up his car and pulling away. He remembered leaving his grieving father with nothing but a crumpled handful of cash and a cruel handwritten note telling me to figure it out. The devastating weight of that symmetry crushed him completely. He looked down at the $150 sitting under the metal ledge. The full, horrifying scale of his public and private ruin washed over him in a violent wave. It was not a lifeline. It was a mirror holding the reflection of his own monstrosity directly in front of him. Craig covered his face with both hands and broke into loud, uncontrollable sobs. These were not a performance. They were tears of profound, inescapable shame. He wept as the crushing reality of a 15-year sentence finally anchored itself somewhere deep inside him. I offered no final word of comfort. I drew the heavy plastic receiver away from my ear and placed it quietly back onto its hook, cutting off the sound of his weeping. I rose from the hard plastic chair, buttoned my suit jacket, pulled my shoulders back, and lifted my chin. I turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors of the visitor center. I did not look back. My posture was perfectly straight, completely unburdened by the ghost of the son I used to know. The last thread binding me to a lifetime of unappreciated sacrifice had been permanently and cleanly severed. 2 years passed with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally lived entirely on my own terms. I found myself in the front row of a vast sunlit university stadium. The morning air was warm, buzzing with the electric energy of graduation day. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, hands resting comfortably in my lap. I was not there as a corporate titan or a billionaire philanthropist. I was simply a grandfather waiting to watch a young man who had rebuilt his life from absolute scratch. I looked out over the sea of students in black caps and flowing gowns. Ethan was among them. He looked nothing at all like the broken, terrified boy who had crumbled on the marble steps of a luxury hotel 2 years before. He had been completely transformed. He had put in 20 grueling hours a week filing paperwork at my foundation, while carrying a heavy course load at the university. He had covered his own rent, bought his own groceries, and learned precisely what it meant to earn his place in the world. He had not asked me for a single penny since the morning we signed that employment contract on my front porch. A heavy, expectant hush settled over the sprawling stadium as the university dean approached the wooden podium to introduce the valedictory speaker. When he called Ethan's name, a deep wave of pride moved through my entire body. Ethan rose and climbed the steps to the main stage with a strong, confident bearing. He adjusted the tall microphone and looked out across the vast crowd of proud parents and graduating students. He did not speak about his mother or his father. He made no mention of the public scandal or the federal prison sentences that had shattered his former life. Instead, he spoke about the heavy, unforgiving weight of reality and what absolute independence truly means. Ethan gripped the edges of the podium, his voice ringing out, clear and steady across the stadium speakers. He told the thousands listening that the greatest lesson of his life had not come from a textbook or a prestigious lecture hall. He said it had come in the form of a wide floor mop and a crumpled 150. He spoke about how easy it is to become trapped in the toxic illusion of privilege and how completely blinding unearned wealth can be. He told the crowd that true survival is not about finding someone willing to pull you back up when you fall. He said, true survival is about finding the absolute internal strength to stand back up on your own 2 feet when nobody else is coming to save you. Ethan paused and looked directly down at the front row, his eyes locking fully with mine. The entire stadium seemed to hold its breath as he delivered his closing words. He said the man who saved his life had not done it by writing a generous check or offering a comfortable lie. He said the man who saved him had done it by drawing a hard, unforgiving boundary and demanding absolute accountability. He broke into a strong, genuine smile and told the silent crowd that the man who taught him the real value of a hard-earned dollar and the worth of self-respect was his grandfather. The applause that surged through that stadium was absolutely deafening. I sat in my chair and let the roar of the crowd wash over me, feeling a deep warmth spread through my chest. I did not clap wildly or call out his name, but the quiet satisfaction that settled in me was more profound than any corporate triumph I had ever known. The boy had become a man. After the formal ceremony, the manicured campus lawns dissolved into a joyful chaos of families posing for photographs and exchanging embraces. I stood near the edge of the graduation stage and waited. Ethan moved through the crowd and walked straight toward me, his hard-earned diploma held firmly in his right hand. He stopped directly in front of me. We didn't exchange 1,000 words. We didn't need to. There was a clear, perfect understanding between us that only comes from mutual respect earned the hard way. A fellow student paused nearby and offered to take a photograph of us. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my grandson facing the camera. I didn't arrange my features into any polished camera-ready expression. For the first time in more than 15 years, a real smile, a genuine one, broke across my face. It reached all the way to my eyes. Standing beside that young man, I saw clearly what had happened to the wreckage of a poisoned family. Every last trace of it had been scattered to the wind. What rose in its place was something built from the ground up, honesty, hard limits, and a love that had been properly earned rather than purchased. I made my way back to my private study, high above the city. The polished walnut desk was bare, except for a single thick leather-bound folder sitting squarely at its center. Gareth waited near the wooden doors, rigid aluminum briefcase at his side. He didn't speak as I crossed to the desk and pulled the folder open. Inside was the full annual impact report for the $150 trust. I pressed my palm slowly across the pages, letting the weight of what we had accomplished over the past 24 months settle over me. What those figures showed was nothing short of extraordinary. More than 3,000 elderly men and women across the country had received fully funded, aggressive legal representation through the foundation. Every one of them had been a target, cheated, pressured, and threatened by the very people closest to them. I read through the case summaries how our team of hard-edged corporate attorneys had locked down fraudulent asset transfers and clawed back stolen retirement savings. forged powers of attorney had been challenged and dismantled. Hundreds of predatory family members now sat in cells. One case stopped me cold, a 70-year-old widow thrown out of her own house by her daughter. Thanks to our intervention moving fast, she was home again, and her daughter was the one facing federal charges. That contemptible handful of bills my son had left on a kitchen counter had transformed into a relentless financial force for justice. I shut the folder and felt something lift, something that had been pressing down on me for a very long time. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stood there. The afternoon sun was angling low, dragging gold and amber across the city skyline, turning every glass tower into a burning copper column. A deep, settled quiet had taken root somewhere in my chest that nothing was going to dislodge. 15 years. That is how long I carried what my son did to me. Night after night, I lay awake asking myself what I had missed, what I had done wrong, how the child I raised had curdled into something capable of driving a grieving father into the street. But there at that window, the answer finally came through clear. It was never something I had done. Greed is its own disease, incurable, insidious, and chosen. I had not broken my son or his wife. There was no petty score I was settling. What I did was step back, withdraw the cushion of my fortune, and position a mirror directly in front of them. Every crushing consequence that followed was one they had precision built for me and were simply forced to receive themselves. The infected limbs of my family had been cut away cleanly. That amputation hurt, but it was the cut that allowed everything underneath to finally mend. The billion-dollar enterprise Craig had spent years scheming to seize was now standing guard over thousands of people the world had walked past without a second glance. Gareth came to stand at my side, both of us facing the last light bleeding from the sky. He had been the keenest instrument in my arsenal, and the one man I had trusted without reservation through all of it. He reached into his rigid aluminum briefcase and set a single clean sheet of paper at the corner of my polished walnut desk. With quiet, measured respect, he asked whether my mind was made up about the board, whether I was prepared to sign and formally relinquish my position as chief executive of my biotechnology empire. I turned from the glass and studied the dotted line below. My entire life had been one long campaign building, accumulating, clawing for position in an arena designed to grind men into dust. I had attacked illness in the laboratory. I had scoured the poison out of my own family line. My legacy was intact, and I had pointed my grandson toward a life he could stand behind. Every war had been fought. Every empire had been built. I reached inside my jacket, brought out my gold pen, and pressed it to the page. My signature came out in a single clean stroke, and with it came a stillness that spread through the whole room. I capped the pen, slid it back into my pocket, and looked at Gareth. The paperwork was done, I told him. The handover was complete. I faced the horizon one final time and did up my jacket button. 74 years, I told him. 74 years of grinding, building, and standing guard over what I had made, while men in tailored suits sharpened their knives behind my back. I let a slow, real smile settle across my face. It was time, I said, to actually live. The only thing breaking the silence of the late afternoon was the soft, mechanical click of my fishing reel turning. I was out at the secluded lake, settled into a weathered chair at the water's edge. No skyscrapers in sight. The noise of the city completely behind me. The sun was going down and throwing a warm copper sheet across the water. The ripples caught the light and threw it back. I could feel every crease around my eyes. But those lines hadn't been gouged there by dread or sorrow, not this time. For the first time in 15 years, they simply belonged to a man at rest. My phone sat dark on the dock next to my tackle box. Nothing buzzed, nothing blinked, no voicemails, no desperate pleas, no son calling with some fresh catastrophe requiring a $2 million rescue from federal prison. None of the manufactured tenderness that had always been a wrapper around another demand. All of it, that whole suffocating grinding racket, had gone permanently quiet. Out here the air tasted of nothing but itself. No hunger in it, no calculation. Nothing of a man who used to look at his own father and see a balance sheet with an expiration date. I sent the line out and watched the little red bobber kiss the surface and go still. I breathed in slowly. Then I thought about the gap, the sheer, almost incomprehensible distance between who I was and who I am. 15 years ago, I was standing on a cold concrete driveway with nothing. A grieving widower discarded like something pulled from the trash, left to disappear quietly into whatever came next. They read my silence as surrender. My broken heart they took for weakness. What they could not account for, what they had apparently scrubbed from memory, was the essential nature of the man they were dealing with. I don't fold. I didn't simply endure the game they built around me. I took it apart. I moved onto their board. I replaced their pieces and drafted rules they never saw coming. The worst thing done to a parent, I turned it into armor for thousands of people no one else was protecting. It was never about noise or spectacle. I raised the mirror. Their greed did the rest, consuming them from the inside out. Right now, Ethan is at a plain metal desk downtown, drawing an honest hourly wage. He covers his own rent every month, manages his own finances, and is laying a future together with his own hands. On weekends, he comes out here not looking for a check, but to sit on this dock and tell me about his coursework, his setbacks, the things he is quietly proud of. He severed the cycle, the inherited rod of entitlement, and he did it because I held the line and gave him nothing he hadn't earned. I gave away a son to greed's slow poison. I held on to my grandson by refusing to protect him from the one thing that could actually save him reality. I brought the reel in hand over hand, feeling the clean resistance of the gears. Across the city, far from this water and this quiet, the marble lobby of my foundation stands open. Every day, thousands of people step through those doors, looking for exactly the kind of protection I once had no one to give me. They arrive shattered and frightened, and they walk out shielded by a battalion of relentless corporate attorneys. Right at the heart of that vast lobby, mounted on a polished black granite pedestal, sits a small, reinforced glass display case. Inside, under careful illumination, rests a crumpled $100 bill, a single $50 bill, and a yellowed piece of paper. The hurried, jagged handwriting remains perfectly legible. You will figure it out. That piece of paper no longer lives tucked away in my private study. It belongs to the world now. It stands as a permanent, immortal monument to every greedy, entitled child who convinces themselves they can plunder the parents who gave them life and simply disappear without consequence. It stands as a silent sentinel for the elderly, a reminder that they are not obligated to absorb abuse from people who happen to share their last name. I gazed out across the still water of the secluded lake as the sun dropped behind the dark tree line, spreading violet and deep blue across the sky. A cool evening breeze moved across my face, carrying pine, and something that felt remarkably like freedom. I settled back into my wooden chair, carrying none of the weight that used to press down on me. Let that small yellow scrap of paper stand as a final, unambiguous warning to anyone who looks at a quiet old man and sees an easy mark. The silence of a betrayed father or a cast-aside grandfather is not surrender. It is not weakness. It is not an old man quietly accepting whatever cruelty has been handed to him. It is the deep-loaded stillness that comes before the storm breaks. It is the patient, deliberate gathering of forces before the natural order reasserts itself. The most enduring lesson this ordeal carved into me is this: a shared bloodline does not entitle anyone to disrespect or exploit you indefinitely. Family is meant to be bedrock, not a nursery for entitlement and quiet betrayal. When people reveal their true character by abandoning you at your lowest, you must find the courage to take them at their word. If you stayed with me all the way to that lakeside dock, I want you to know I am grateful. Not every story ends with noise and courtrooms. Some of the most important ones end in quiet water and an evening breeze. This road costs more than I can put into clean words. It cost years of sleepless nights, a son I buried before he was gone, and a grief that had nowhere to go. What it gave back was something I did not expect: a grandson who learned to stand on his own and a foundation built from the wreckage. I believe God has a way of turning the worst thing done to you into the very tool you need to protect others. The father stories that matter most are rarely the easy ones. The ones worth telling are the ones that nearly broke the man living them. Here is what I carried out of all of it, and I offer it to you plainly. Do not confuse a quiet man's patience for permission to keep taking from him. Silence is not surrender, it is preparation. When someone shows you who they are by leaving you at your lowest, believe them completely. Do not negotiate with that evidence. Blood does not buy anyone the right to use you. Choose the people in your life by how they treat you when you have nothing to offer. If you find yourself raising the next generation, give them reality before you give them comfort. That is the harder gift, and the more lasting one. If this story of a father's quiet reckoning, a real dad's revenge, built not on rage, but on patience and principle, moved something in, you leave a thought in the comments. I read them. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they are not finished, that the story is not over, And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. There are more stories here, and every one of them is worth the hour. Thank you for sitting with this one. Take care of yourself out there. I will see you in the next story.